Hi everyone, thanks for joining today's webinar, DevOps 101, Moving Fast with Confidence. Speaking today, we have Donnie Burkholz, Research Director at 451 Research, and Ravi Tharasai, Senior Solutions Marketing Manager here at New Relic. Before we get started, there's a few housekeeping items to go over. First, today's webinar will be recorded, and a recording will be sent to you shortly after the presentation. There will also be a live Q&A after the presentation, so submit any questions you might have in the questions and go to webinar control panel. And lastly, we'll send out a brief survey at the end of the presentation, so please take the time to give us feedback, and we'd love to hear from you. Right now, I'll hand it off to Donnie, and he'll take it away.
Thank you. Appreciate the introduction, and it's great to be here today talking to y'all. This is Donnie Burkholz, and at 451 Research, I spend a lot of time focusing on emerging trends around development, DevOps, and IT ops. And today we're going to spend our time talking mostly about DevOps, but also about some emerging trends and technologies impacting DevOps, like containers and microservices. And then we're going to start out with some of the drivers in terms of why should we be doing this DevOps thing in the first place. So with that, I wanted to go right into some research that we've been collecting over the past few years, looking at one of the big drivers behind DevOps, which comes down to really digital transformation in the end, and trying to make that term that I'm sure you hear a lot in marketing materials more realistic, more about what really underlies all of these companies that want to be like Airbnb and Tesla and Twitter and so on. And what I'm showing you here is a gradual change in IT priorities over time. We survey 1,500 to 2,000 IT decision makers every year for the past 4 years looking at this. And what's really interesting is we're starting to see a gradual shift in priorities from keeping the lights on, cost cutting, doing things as they were, to a new approach. It's a balanced approach of more agility while minimizing risk at the same time. And that's the light blue and the orange at the top there. Over time, we're seeing this gradually increase, and I expect to see that continue as more and more companies realize that they are software companies, regardless of whether they're in manufacturing or hospitality or finance or anything else. More and more companies are realizing technology is the future of their business, and it's not just something that keeps their Windows desktops working. And here's another data point. Over the past 4 years now, 3 years, we've been collecting data every quarter from, as you can see below, 600 to 1,000 people every quarter, looking at the way their companies think about technology. And more companies are thinking about themselves like early adopters, right? They're saying, look, technology isn't something that we can afford to be conservative about. It's something where we have to make sure we're investing in the future of our business. We're thinking about not safe choices so much as we are about smart bets. Because we have realized that our business is going to survive on software, and so we have to start figuring out how do we build a competitive advantage, and how do we move faster than other companies in the same industry as we are. And picking up the right software early is the way to go about that. Here's one more data point I wanted to show you around the whys of this DevOps thing before we really get into DevOps itself. And this is, asking companies about their expectations in terms of the technology transformation, but also business transformation over the next few years. And you can see that this divides into two stark different populations, one of them on the left in the blue and one on the right in the orange, where they have very different views of how much business transformation, how much technology transformation is required. And a friend of mine likes to say that it's not mandatory that any business survive. Right? We can let natural selection take its place. There's no reason for your company to be around in 3 years or in 5 years. And if you want to stick around, you have to evolve. Right? And in many cases, you have to evolve quickly to keep up with your competition, whether that competition is brand new startups in every industry, or whether it's some traditional competitors who are moving faster than they were before. And that's what brings us to DevOps. And we're going to spend the next portion of this webinar talking about what DevOps is all about, trying to define it a little bit, talking more about what is it more specifically and how do you do it, as well as where some of your peers are with DevOps adoption today, both DevOps more broadly as well as some of the most popular tools used to move in the right direction. The best way to think about DevOps at a very high level is taking agile development and really extending it more broadly in both directions, right? Not just about a 2-week sprint followed by passing it off to QA, passing it off to security, it sits there 6 months later, hits the deploy window, right? You're doing agile development, but you're not getting the most important benefits, which are the ability to iterate more quickly between the business and the customer, right? It's not about developing the software more reliably, it's about developing the right software. And that's the right software from a customer perspective, it's the right software from an operator perspective, production support, right? They need a lot of features in the software that development doesn't necessarily think about up front. And if you're able to build a more collaborative environment and get what we call OODA loops, observe, orient, decide, act loops, more quickly across the entire organization, you can start to build and deliver the right product and bring that startup style mindset to any business. And that's really what DevOps is all about. And if you want to get a little bit more specific, you can come up with fancy definitions. Here's mine. It may be hard to remember, and so we're going to talk through after this, what is it really all about? What are some of the pillars of DevOps, and how do you get there? And so if we think about what are these pillars of DevOps, it really comes down to 3 main ones in my opinion. Culture is the first one, automation is the second one, and there's a couple of different aspects to that. And finally, measurement is the final pillar, right? And there's, again, multiple different aspects to that, and we'll talk through each of those in more detail right after this. The one thing that's started to change in the way people are thinking about DevOps is that it's increasingly gaining a focus on lean as well, right, in terms of minimizing waste in the process and thinking about what are the rate-limiting steps that are preventing us from delivering reliable software more quickly, how can we eliminate those one step at a time, and how can we use a collaborative DevOps style approach to do so. So we're going to first talk about culture. And there are 2 really important aspects to that. One of them is building that collaborative environment, right, such that you're trying to get everybody in the same room. And when I say everybody, I was actually just at a talk from Amazon this morning, and they talk about 2 pieces teams a lot. And they have the people who build the software, the people who test the software, and the people who support the software in production. They're all part of the same team, right? They're not siloed off in different organizations. I worked recently with an insurance company, and their development organization was in the middle of the country. The ops organization was on the coast, right? This is not what you want to have if you're trying to move toward DevOps. You need to get everybody in the same room so that you can build empathy and so that you can build a shared understanding of what it is that needs to be built and supported, and how can you build it better in the first place, and how can you do a better job of iterating more quickly by eliminating all those barriers between the silos so that, again, you can build software better because you have a better understanding of the customer, a better understanding of the operator, and you can iterate on it more quickly because you're not slowed down by all these manual gates from ticketing through to product management. Those are all problems that can come up when you're trying to figure out what does it take to move from shipping software every 3 months to every 3 days. And it turns out it takes eliminating a lot of people from the process. Again, it comes up after that as when people are thinking, how do we move from 3 days to every 3 minutes, right? At every step of the road, there's more elimination of manual human processes to be able to move more quickly. And to do so, you have to tear down those silos. And the second really important aspect of culture is, as you're getting rid of all the silos, is making sure to share the knowledge that's been gained so that it's not one small team or one small portion of a team that's learning from these kinds of shared experiences and from moving more quickly, but that they're able to share that knowledge both within your organization but within the broader community as well, because it's really about building this shared community, shared culture of what it takes to build the right software more quickly and more reliably. Now, the second pillar is about automation. And there's a very popular metaphor promoted by a guy named Randy Bias, where he talks about pets versus cattle. And this is really a mindset shift in the way people talk about how do you maintain servers, right? It used to be in the old days, or in traditional or legacy environments, servers are maintained like pets, right? Each one is given a name. Maybe that's a Star Trek name, maybe it's Barbie dolls, and they're carefully and artisanally handcrafted and maintained, and if they get sick, you take them to the vet, you carefully work on them. And the new world is very different, right? It's one where we're talking about fleets of servers, and we're talking about, let's say, mail server 1 through 20, web server 1 through 20. We're not carefully and individually naming things anymore because they are not important on an individual basis. What is important is the fleet and the service that's being delivered from that fleet or from that cluster of servers, of VMs, of containers, and so on. This is the really critical mindset shift that needs to happen in the way you think about how you're maintaining and deploying and monitoring all of the software, is thinking about what is the service and the cluster, not what's happening with any individual within that cluster. But if 3 servers go down out of a 10-server cluster, if the service quality to the end user is not degraded, that's not a problem worth waking anybody up for at 2 a.m. And that's a mindset shift that can be difficult for some people to understand and to make happen in practice. And so there's a couple of different aspects to this automation pillar of DevOps, right? We use that overlying metaphor of pets versus cattle to think about what to do. But what do? Well, we apply this idea of infrastructure as code. Right? We take all of the servers, we figure out how do you implement them in the form of code so that you can get environmental parity between the development environment, the test environment, the staging environment, production, and automatically replicate any of those on demand identically all the way through the process. That's what we're talking about when we say infrastructure as code, right? This is what enables you to think about clusters rather than individual pets, because it's trivial to replicate that same image over and over and over as it's implemented in the form of code. Now, one example I always like to talk about is Knight Capital, right? Knight Capital is a high-frequency trading firm, and in the span of about 45 minutes, they lost almost $500 million. And they did so because they did not effectively automate their deployment pipeline, and they did not effectively think about their production servers in the form of a fleet. Instead, they were all pets. And what happened was they missed the deployment to one of their production servers, spent 45 minutes debugging the problem. By the time they had figured it out, they lost $460 million. Now, this is an extreme example, but it is one where you can tie things very clearly into the financial relevance. Now, the second side of this is continuous delivery, right? Automating not just the underlying infrastructure, but also the build pipeline. How can you make sure that every step of the process, all the way through that software lifecycle, you have an automated way to advance things on through? And then people talk about a difference between continuous delivery and continuous deployment, where there is a human intervention at that last step that says, let's go live with this. And in some cases, that can be a reasonable way to move toward the right direction. Or maybe in the case of something that's not a web application, that could even be where things end up. So where are things today? Things are pretty manual, right? Most people are still mostly manual with limited automation, but things are gradually moving in this cattle-like direction rather than the pet-like direction. And it's going to take some time for it to get there. Now, the final pillar of DevOps is measurement. This is a really important one. This is about measuring the infrastructure, measuring the application, but also measuring the progress of the organization and measuring, are you delivering software faster than before? You should be monitoring that, right? It's really important not just to monitor the infrastructure, not even just to monitor the application, but to monitor the service quality delivered to the user and to monitor the progress of your organization in moving toward the right kinds of approaches. Right? And modern software for monitoring, for measuring, has really changed, right? The expectations have changed. It used to be that all of this software for metrics was terrible. There's been a resurgence of interest over, let's say, the past 5 to 7 years in providing a better user experience, right? You look at, for example, even the logos of the popular monitoring software from a decade ago and today, and they're dramatically different, right? The design is there. And that's reflected in the user experience too, right? It used to be that people optimize only for developer experience, but now we're optimizing not just for developers, also for operators, and providing shared tools to help build that empathy and help build those measurements all the way through. Now, if we look at the tools in use, there's a lot of variation in terms of which tools people are using, which kinds of which kinds of tools people are using to implement DevOps, at least the tool side of DevOps, the automation, the measurements. But you can see that performance monitoring, log management, right, one of the reasons we're here today, is really popular in terms of this list. Right? Most people have adopted that, and so most of those people are able to take advantage of that in terms of adding new metrics into it to measure their progress toward faster release processes. Because most of us still aren't releasing that fast. Here's some data from a survey we did last year, and what we found in that study was that most of the people we surveyed were still releasing monthly. Right? They moved forward from the quarterly releases; those are now a way of the past. But monthly is still not good enough, and that's what we saw when we asked a little bit more deeply. Is that everybody, regardless of how fast they were releasing today, everybody was getting demands from the business to release even faster. Because the business could come up with ideas and iterations and customer feedback more quickly than the technology organization could deliver on them. And then the faster you can deliver, the faster you can get to that right product, and the faster you can reach that product market fit that everybody's striving for, right? So that you're not building the wrong thing in an 18-month process or even in a month-long process, but you're releasing changes to the customers to see how they work as soon as possible. And so how do we implement DevOps, right? Or how do we implement the tools that enable DevOps, right? Because there's the collaboration, but there's also the automation, there's also the measurement. And containers are one of the very well-timed technologies that came along just in time to help people get moving more quickly and more reliably, right? Which is the reason we're all here. Here's some data that I mined from a developer forum called Stack Overflow, looking at a lot of different container technologies. And what you can see is that containers have been around for a long time. They're nothing new, right? We've had things like LXC. We've had all kinds of different Linux and BSD and Solaris container technologies for a long time. But Docker was the one that really took off, right? And it took off because it was very well timed with the DevOps movement, but also because it made these things much easier to use. And it made it very easy to get the same environment in a very lightweight fashion all the way from development through to production. And so that was developers, but Docker's also a hit in production at this point too, right? Not many technologies were able to pick up this quickly in production environments. It's just a few years old now. We're already seeing it in use in about 15% of cloud users have a Dockerized app in production at this point, while 31% have something in pilot. Right, this is picking up really quickly in an enterprise environment, much more so than we typically see. And so Docker is one of the main ways that people are building out these kinds of environments so that they can move more quickly. But what do you do with a container once you've got it? Well, you've got to put it together into a service that's delivered to the end user, right? And one of the new approaches to that is called microservices. Microservices were most recently popularized by a guy named Steve Yegi, who was at Amazon and moved to Google. And he made a very fortunate accident for the rest of the industry. He wrote a memo that was intended to be internal only for Google employees and accidentally posted it to the public via Google+. And was very generous, and also his employer was very generous in not having to retract that memo, so that we were able to learn that one of the big pushes Amazon made years ago that enabled them to keep moving quickly, to keep releasing products so fast today, is that they required that data transfers between different teams had to be using an API over the network, right? They couldn't be gated on manual processes, emailing spreadsheets back and forth. They had to be over the network, right? So this is what people are doing with containers. They're building out these independent microservices that can share data, share processes with each other across the network, right, in a loosely coupled fashion, so that every individual team can move quickly and not be gated on other teams and other processes. Unfortunately, what happens once you move from monolith to microservices is you get all the benefits of removing single points of failure, of being able to move more quickly, not gating on others, but you run into a lot of complexity. Here's some graphs of all the different interactions between microservices at some of the web companies that have been writing about them. And you can see that they're incredibly complicated. And so the question that comes up is, once you've got something like this, how do you even understand what's happening? And when a problem comes up, it's even more complicated, Because every time there's a problem in a system, you always have to be more clever to debug the problem than you were to build the system in the first place. And you need a lot of tools to support that, right? Specifically, you need tools that support you to track the metrics, track the interactions, and then trace them across all of these different services, and then pull that back together and understand how is the user experience degraded, and what do we have to do to fix it, right? And universally, these early innovators of microservices have said monitoring is really key to it, right? Once we broke things down, and once we're able to move quickly, it turns out we also have to have a way to ensure reliability and ensure SLAs, and monitoring every one of those independently, using tools that let you think about things like cattle rather than pets is critical to this. Here's another example from REA, another company that's moved to microservices and has spent a lot of time talking about it. They created an open source library for testing. And then the second piece, again, very important, right? They made sure there was really good monitoring, right? Because if you can't get the metrics about the applications, their health, their problems, and the user experiences that people are running into, you're not going to be able to fix the problems that crop up. And these are very complex systems. Inevitably, problems will crop up that you didn't expect. So you have to have insight into what's happening there to be able to deal with them, right? So as people are moving toward these microservices so that they can get agility and so that they can lower risk, they're starting to run into a lot of problems with monitoring, right? In terms of how do you monitor things at this level of scale, at, let's say, container scale, right, where you have thousands of different containers and hundreds of different services. How do you monitor the complexity? How do you monitor containers or processes that spin up and spin down in the span of 5 seconds, right? You can't use a lot of traditional tools for that anymore because you might have to restart a centralized monitoring service every time something new shows up, and that doesn't work anymore, right? How do you integrate business value into this so that you can start to share knowledge of the things that matter across all these different silos that you're trying to break down and build that empathy so that you can break them down? How do you understand the queues that are going to be passed across all these different services? There's a lot of questions in terms of how do we monitor microservices environments? What do we do about them? But they are the thing that is letting people move more quickly and do so more reliably by breaking these services apart. And this is, in practice, how people are able to move more quickly with reliability in the way they're looking to, which is really what DevOps is all about. And so to really summarize my portion of this presentation, so that the how of all of this is DevOps, right? Pulling together the culture, the automation, and the measurement to be able to understand what's going on in all of these different environments. The what is building out microservices because they are the software architectures that enable you to move quickly and reliably. And the why, like I said earlier, it's about natural selection. I mean, this really is an issue of your company surviving in the long term. Is will they become a software company? Can they move toward modern software architectures to support that? And then can they effectively understand what's going on in these very complicated environments, right? Can they measure them? Can they monitor them? Application health, service health, user experience, so that they can fix problems when they inevitably do arise. Because you're going to be shipping more quickly, and you have to have good ways to support that. And so the challenge with all of this is a complicated process. This is a long transformation. The challenge is not in necessarily understanding the challenges in execution, right? There's a lot of cultural gaps and a lot of tooling gaps from getting from where you are today to that DevOps journey. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to Robbie from New Relic, who's going to present his perspective on how you can do DevOps with New Relic.
Thanks so much, Donnie. That was fantastic information. Folks, we're going to transition to Q&A in just a minute here. So just a reminder that if you'd like to ask Donnie a question, just enter it through the questions panel. I see a couple of people have already done that. Before we do that, I wanted to just do a quick introduction on New Relic and how we help some of our customers around DevOps. And for those of you that don't know about us, New Relic is a digital intelligence company. We provide full stack monitoring from infrastructure to application to the user experience. And so our aspiration is really to be the first best place that our customers look to understand their digital business. We're a 9-year-old company. We've been public for a little over 2 years. We've got 14,000 customers, and those customers range from very large enterprises like GE and Adobe to smaller companies that are really trying to disrupt their industry, like Airbnb and Major League Baseball Advanced Media Services. So we've worked with a variety of companies, and many of them are working on some of the DevOps challenges that Donnie mentioned in his presentation. What we find when we work with our customers is this challenge around data and the roadblocks around data that really limit the impact of DevOps culture changes. And there's two dimensions that I wanted to raise to your attention. First, on the left side, Donnie mentioned this component, this cultural component to DevOps, really trying to bring Dev and Ops together. And what we find with our customers is really digital is becoming a team sport. It's Dev and Ops, it's product management, customer support. Many stakeholders are trying to understand the state of their digital business in a DevOps environment. And what frequently happens is all of these teams are looking at different data sources. And when you have silos and siloed data that Donnie mentioned, it's really hard to build up that empathy and that collaboration that you need to be successful at DevOps. And then the other dimension is around the complexity of today's IT infrastructure. It's increasingly dynamic with huge servers of fleets and containers, microservices. There's a lot of data being generated from all of this infrastructure and applications, but it's hard to really understand the impact of the application changes that you're making across this very complex infrastructure. So as you move to DevOps, you move to be agile, make more changes, you're really hindered unless you have the right data to understand the impact of those changes. When we work with our clients, we really find that data can be a key to unlocking DevOps success. And really measuring DevOps is a critical ingredient. And we think there's three big components of this. First is having full stack visibility. You need to understand what's happening from the infrastructure to the applications to the user experience, so that as you're making changes more frequently, you understand the impact of those changes at every layer of your application stack. Second, as you're trying to build that cultural change, you really need a way to consume that data in a way that's easy for Dev, for Ops, and for everyone in your digital team. So we provide dashboards that turn that data into information that can be consumed across your organization, so that everyone's in sync and understand the status of their digital business. And then the last part of this is about that agility, that component of moving fast while maintaining stability. And you really need real-time data to understand how things are progressing as you're moving more quickly. You don't have time to wait around for the data to come to you. You need it in real time. So we provide all three of these components, and we find that our customers that take advantage of this are really getting more value and more success from their DevOps initiatives. So let's take a look at what this might look like. Here's an example of a dashboard, and I'm going to direct you to three different components of this and the questions that you'll answer with this kind of information. First, at a most basic level, the first thing you want to understand is my site up across the regions that I'm supporting? So the top row of this is looking at the availability of this customer's website across different regions. Then the second part of this is, are my critical transactions performing well? So if you're an e-commerce company or a retail company, really you want to understand how well your checkout transactions are performing, and you want to understand that at all times. And then the last part, you might want to understand how is your infrastructure supporting to support all of these things. And so at the bottom layer, you can see performance across the infrastructure, and that is understanding whether or not it's in the public cloud, in your data center, or within a Docker container. So again, you're looking at three layers of understanding, and this can be customized to support the specific metrics of your particular business. Here's kind of an example of how this looks like for some of our customers. In particular, one customer did a demonstration of this at our recent reInvent booth. Dev and ops team at this customer start every day looking at New Relic, looking at a dashboard similar to the one that you saw on the previous slide. It helps ensure that everyone understands the state of the business and knows what needs to be worked on for that current day. As they start to make application changes, they take advantage of some of the New Relic's integrations with other DevOps tools like BlazeMeter to spin up a load test, and then they can monitor the performance of that load test right in their New Relic dashboard, understanding both the end user performance and the application performance in one single dashboard. As you start deploying to production, New Relic has deployment markers that help you mark each of your builds to production and the performance impact of each of those builds. So in one screen, you can see all of your builds and the performance of each of those builds so that you can quickly understand if there's been a degradation of performance. And then the last part is around alerts. And when there's an issue, when you're making changes more quickly, you want to make sure that if there's an error, if you're in Night Capital and there's been a bug, you want to be alerted about that very quickly. And so alerts help you and your diverse teams be notified when there's an error that goes above a threshold on certain metrics. And you can instrument those metrics across any part of the application stack. So that's a quick summary of how we can help you in your DevOps. If you'd like to learn more about DevOps or about how New Relic supports DevOps, you can take a look at our DevOps Hub. It's got an easy-to-remember URL, newrelic.com/DevOps. And with that, I'm going to open it up for questions. And just a reminder again, you can enter your questions through the questions panel. So, Donnie, I think the first question here is for you, and it's about getting started with DevOps. And if you could talk about your recommendation on the most important DevOps, part of DevOps to get started.
Yeah, great question. It's one that I get a lot. I actually heard it once already this morning at a local enterprise who's making that DevOps shift right now. And typically, when you're thinking about this DevOps thing, much like any other major change you're trying to make, the most important thing is not to try and do it all at once, but try and gradually build up momentum, gradually generate some small wins in small teams and small parts of the organization, instead of saying, okay, hold on, folks, let's just stop shipping software for the next 6 months while we retool everything for DevOps, because that's never going to fly. Right, that's not even going to fly with the CIO or the CTO, let alone outside of the technology organization. And so, I think the most important part of getting started is really finding a place, finding a team, ideally a team that's, maybe even more siloed than the rest of it, or a new initiative with perhaps a lower risk than taking down, some traditional applications that are generating millions of dollars a day, and starting there. Right, and saying, hey, let's try out this two-piece of team thing with, let's say a mobile campaign or some kind of a campaign website or anything along those lines, right? That's what I generally recommend in terms of starting points, is pick a small team that won't have a huge impact and that can ideally start in sort of a greenfield environment so that you can see the maximum possible benefit from trying to move toward DevOps with that kind of a project. And then you can gradually move it farther back into more traditional legacy processes over the course of time. Now, in terms of, I guess, what exactly to start with once you've got that kind of team, I would say it is, get people in the same room, right? That is the single most important thing you can do, is just try and build better communication within all the different people involved in these applications, right? And if that's not the same physical room, then it's going to be a little bit more challenging, right? But there are all kinds of popular communication tools like Slack and HipChat or other IM tools that you can use to create a virtual room, right? Where you can get everybody together, sharing knowledge in a transparent setting, right? That's really important, is getting all of those one-to-one private conversations that have been happening and turning them public so that everybody can learn from them and understand each other's perspectives.
Great. All right. Thanks, Donnie. So the next question is actually, for me, is a question around, does New Relic have machine learning-based anomaly detection feature? So actually, just past fall, we announced a new offering called Project Seymour, which is in a beta right now, that does just that. It provides machine learning-based anomaly detection, AI-based anomaly detection. It's not generally available yet, but you can learn more about it at newrelic.com/Seymour. So that's newrelic.com/SEYMOUR. And there's even a newsletter to learn more and be notified about the launch. So feel free to check that out. Next one is actually again for you, Donnie, and I think it actually kind of piggybacks off of some of your discussion about Docker adoption and some of the growth there in terms of that adoption. This question is about serverless computing and about how you see that impacting DevOps, and as well, how do you see the adoption of serverless computing going relative to Docker?
Yeah, good question. And you know, I spend a lot of time right now doing research on serverless computing, on the market, the runtimes, the ecosystem, all of that. And so, you know, there are a lot of questions coming up with serverless in general, but also with serverless as it pertains to DevOps. People are saying, oh, well, it's serverless. Do we need ops anymore? Is DevOps still even a thing? And, you know, the answer that consistently comes back from people who have already been experimenting, already been putting production apps on something that's a lot like serverless, right? Mobile backend as a service has a lot of similarities to serverless, and in fact is a specific use case of these serverless runtimes right now. The answer that comes back is pretty consistently, so, you know, the way we've been talking about DevOps today is culture automation measurement, right? Those problems no longer exists with serverless, and really the answer is none of them, right? They're all still there. You still have to have the cultural collaboration, right? You still have to own the performance and availability of the services wherever you choose to run them. And you still have to have automated deployment pipelines, right? And serverless hasn't solved that for you, right? It will run the code for you, and it will do so in a very interesting pricing model, very interesting packaging model, but it doesn't remove the need to be responsible for application performance, right? It doesn't remove the need to be responsible for application availability. It doesn't remove the need to have metrics and insight into those applications and to be able to solve those kinds of problems. Now, in terms of what we're seeing for adoption, the most recent survey we ran of our IT decision maker panel was suggesting that about 10% of them had been using serverless in some kind of setting, not necessarily a production environment, but they had been evaluating it at least. And so it's still very early days, but it is starting to pick up, and it's looking pretty interesting.
Great, okay. And then the next question here I see is, for me, is about, does New Relic have monitoring for Azure App Services? So yes, absolutely. New Relic, we support Azure. The dashboards that you saw can work just as well with Azure, and New Relic supports .NET as well. So yes, go to newrelic.com/Azure, and you can see more and learn more about that support. Donnie, here's the next one for you, and this is, I think, more of a role-based impact. So if you're in operations, what should you do to prepare for DevOps?
Yeah, good question again. Really enjoying these questions today. So if you're on the ops side, what you should be doing to prepare is making sure that you are not too resistant to change. Because when we talk to, let's say, IT ops executives, sometimes what we get back is they're saying that their teams are dividing into two different populations. One of those populations is willing to move forward, and the other one is very resistant to change and is saying, look, we're happy with the way things were. You know, we really like logging into servers by hand and running top, and that's how we monitor. Whereas the other side is willing to essentially learn software engineering techniques. I mean, that's what you have to do. That's part of infrastructure as code, is you have to learn how to write the code that implements the infrastructure. And so, you know, the most important thing that you can do if you're in ops is learn how to code and start learning these infrastructure as code tools and start learning measurement and monitoring tools that will let you think about things in this pets versus cattle mindset as well.
Great. Okay, and then another one, I think, kind of related. It says you spoke about having DevOps and developers in one place. What's your opinion of site reliability engineering, Google's approach to combining teams? So maybe you can just briefly describe the site reliability engineering concept and then kind of your opinion on that.
Yeah, sure. So the SRE idea, and this is timely because SRECon just happened earlier this week. A very interesting conference focused on site reliability engineering. The idea is having a team of people who are software engineers, really, but focused on infrastructure. It's specifically focused on owning the performance and the availability and the latency of those applications, kind of soup to nuts, right? And so you might think about them as a blend of kind of an automation engineer and a performance team all together in one, with some who are more focused on different aspects of that, right? Like, so for example, in Google's implementation, they have two different kinds of SREs they hire. They have one who's more developer focused, and they have one who's more infrastructure focused, who has to have a really strong understanding of layer 7 networking, of all the different sort of infrastructure and data center technologies involved from a software level. And they are not rackers and stackers. They are not application developers. They're in that middle ground where they're focused on a very specific aspect of the full stack of the application and infrastructure that they live in, which is being responsible for good service quality to the end user.
Great. All right, and then it looks like just one last question here, and this is related to security. And DevOps is obviously a lot about moving faster, more agility. How do you move towards DevOps while keeping security in mind and meeting those security requirements?
Yeah, I think how you do it in practice, what we run into with most of the enterprise we talk to about this is that security is increasingly getting pulled into closer to the development process. Instead of being a gate afterwards, right? Like you might develop the software, then throw it to QA, and then throw it to security. Instead, it's getting pulled and becoming an integral part of the development and testing process. We see many more companies who are taking continuous integration, right, and moving it well beyond just a code functionality test or unit test. They're pulling in all kinds of different security scans, whether those are static or dynamic, whether those are focused on the network, focused on the servers, focused on the code, or focused on the performance, right? And security is one example of where those are getting pulled into continuous integration. One example I just heard this morning in another talk was this company had talked to the security team, said, okay, all those scans that you do now that are a manual phase gate before we can deploy, instead, we're going to put those into CI. And the first application they did that on was the first application in the history of the entire company that had not gotten delayed in the security audit. There were 0 problems that came up. And so it worked very effectively to help them deploy software more quickly. And so I think it's, security is integral to all of this. It doesn't go away, but it gets folded into part of that short loop instead of being sort of a waterfall style appendage.
Got it. That makes perfect sense. Okay. Well, great. Looks like that's all the questions that we have for today. So again, thank you everyone for joining us today. After we close today's call, there's going to be a quick survey. So would really appreciate if you could give us some feedback. Your feedback really matters to us. And as mentioned at the top, we'll send an email with the recording. But again, thanks again for your time and have a great rest of your day.